There is something particularly charming about Christmas in the English countryside. Snow-covered lanes, the faint peal of church bells, and the warm glow of lanterns from cottage windows all combine to create a scene fit for a postcard. And in the village of Winterfold, perched neatly between a rolling hill and a thick yew wood, Christmas had always been the most festive time of the year. It was on the 23rd of December, however, that Winterfold's usual tranquillity yielded to something altogether more troubling. Miss Jane Marple had been invited to Winterfold Manor by her old friend, Mrs. Caroline Weatherby, the widowed lady of the estate. Mrs. Weatherby had been persistently encouraging Miss Marple to spend Christmas away from Satmary Mead, for a change of air, as she said, knowing Caroline's rather lonely situation and recalling her excellent mincemeat tarts. Miss Marple accepted with a warm smile. Winterfold Manor, an elegant Edwardian structure with tall windows and ivy climbing its stonework, was bathed in soft light as Miss Marple arrived. Snowflakes drifted lazily about, and the smell of pine and wood smoke greeted visitors at the front door. She was welcomed inside by the butler, Mr. Hawtrey, an elderly man who carried himself with a dignified stiffness. Inside, the atmosphere was festive, but Miss Marple, well acquainted with human nature, felt an undercurrent of tension beneath the cheer. The assembled household was small but interesting. Mrs. Caroline Weatherby, gracious and silver-haired, was a gentlewoman with warm blue eyes. Though she smiled often, Miss Marple noticed a strain beneath the expression. James Weatherby, Caroline's stepson, was also in residence. A man in his early 40s with a neatly trimmed moustache, he possessed a manner of quiet confidence. James worked as a solicitor in London and had arrived for the holiday though, as Caroline whispered privately to Miss Marple, not entirely willingly. Beatrice Weatherby, James's elegant wife, brought glamour into the otherwise subdued home. Tall, striking, and impeccably groomed, she had a habit of looking at people as though she were evaluating them for usefulness. Then there was Julian Marsh, a family friend, or rather, Caroline's friend. He was a jovial man in his early 50s, round-cheeked and fond of hearty laughter, though somewhat too hearty, Miss Marple thought. He had been a frequent visitor to the manor since Mr. Weatherby's passing 2 years earlier. And lastly, Miss Eliza Crouch, Caroline's companion, a thin, quiet woman with sharp features and sharper eyes. She rarely spoke unless addressed, and Miss Marple could not help noticing how she watched everyone with an intensity bordering on suspicion. It was just after dinner, amidst small talk and the crackling fire of the drawing-room, that the inciting incident occurred. Caroline rose to retrieve a small decorative box she wished to show Miss Marple, an heirloom from her mother's side. She stepped through the archway into her study, only to emit a sharp cry moments later. Miss Marple, nimble despite her age, rose at once and hurried after her. Caroline Weatherby stood frozen in the doorway of the study, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her eyes were fixed upon something inside the room. Miss Marple followed her gaze. There, slumped across the writing desk, lay James Weatherby. Snow from his boots had melted onto the rug, forming small wet patches. His right hand clutched the edge of the desk, while the left hung limp at his side. A glass lay tipped over beside him, a dark stain seeping across a pile of documents. Miss Marple approached cautiously, her expression calm but grave. She touched James's neck lightly. There was no pulse. Mrs. Weatherby swayed, and Miss Marple guided her gently to a nearby chair. Footsteps thundered behind them as Beatrice entered. "What on earth, James?" Her voice cracked. She rushed to her husband's side, then recoiled. "I see. No, he can't be." Miss Marple nodded sadly. Julian Marsh arrived moments later, followed by Miss Crouch, both visibly startled. "Good heavens," Julian muttered. "What happened to him?" Mr. Hawtrey, pale but composed, said quietly, "Shall I telephone the local constable, madam?" Miss Marple inspected the scene with a frown. Nothing was in disarray. No sign of struggle, no wound. Only the glass, the stains, and an odd, faint odor, bitter, medicinal. "Better call him at once," she said gently. While Hawtrey hurried away, Miss Marple peered at the desk. Papers lay scattered, though not violently so, more as if dropped hastily. She noted James's coat draped over the chair, gloves tucked neatly inside the pockets. A man who had come intending only brief business. And yet he was dead. Miss Marple's instincts tingled. She was no stranger to death, nor to the darker impulses of human nature. "It appears," she murmured, "that our Christmas may not be quite as peaceful as hoped." As the household gathered in stunned silence, Miss Marple cast a glance at each of them, Beatrice trembling, Julian frowning, Eliza inscrutable, and Caroline utterly distraught. Somewhere among them, she knew lay the truth, and perhaps a murderer. The local constable, Inspector Harold Briggs, arrived shortly after 9 o'clock. A solid man in his early 50s with a practical manner, he had known Winterfold Manor since boyhood and treated Mrs. Weatherby with cautious respect. "Very sorry about all this, madam," he said gently as he entered the study. "Please, everyone remain available for questioning." Beatrice sat rigidly in an armchair, staring blankly at the hearth. Julian paced by the window, fidgeting with the tassel of the curtain. Miss Crouch hovered like a thin shadow in the background, while Caroline clung to Miss Marple's hand like a lifeline. Inspector Briggs completed a brief examination of the body. "No visible injury," he murmured. "Though this stain on the papers, someone spilled his drink." Miss Marple stepped forward politely. "If I may, Inspector, there was a faint smell to the glass. Bitter almond, or perhaps something akin to it." Briggs shot her a quick, knowing glance. He had heard of Miss Marple. Most in the county constabularies had. "You think it may have been poison?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I don't believe in leaping to conclusions, Inspector, but it did not smell like brandy." Briggs ordered the glass and papers collected. A constable carried the items out for testing. The interviews began. Beatrice sat with spine stiff as a poker. James had no enemies, she insisted. He worked long hours, yes, but he was not involved in anything dangerous. Miss Marple watched her closely. There was grief, surely, but also something else. Fear, resentment. "Was your husband troubled before arriving here?" Miss Marple asked softly. Beatrice's gaze flicked toward her. Hair was tired, pressured with work. Then, after a pause, more argued, but only about small things, normal for any marriage. Julian, seated nearby, gave a small snort at that. Beatrice's eyes flashed. Julian sank into the chair opposite the inspector. "Terrible business. Absolutely dreadful." "Namash," Briggs said. "You were close to the Weatherbys." "Caroline, yes." "James, not particularly. Bit stiff, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple noted how Julian's glances kept straying toward Caroline, though she seemed oblivious. "Where were you between 8 and 9 this evening?" Briggs asked. "In the billiards room, alone. I'm afraid. I occasionally enjoy a solitary game." That, Miss Marple knew, could be either perfectly true or perfectly convenient. Eliza Crutch sat primly, hands folded. Her voice was thin but unwavering. "I was in the kitchen, preparing Mrs. Weatherby's herbal infusion, as I do each evening." Briggs frowned. "The staff can confirm." "Yes." Hawtrey saw me boiling the water. Miss Marple observed the woman's composure. No tremor, no hesitation. Yet her eyes darted now, and then toward Caroline with a look of proprietorial protectiveness. Miss Marple wondered, was Miss Crouch loyal to Caroline, or possessive of her? Caroline trembled as she answered questions. James visited the study shortly after dinner. He said he needed to settle some papers for work. "He seemed restless?" "Restless?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes." "And oh, I do not like to speak ill of the dead, but he had been cross with Beatrice the entire journey from London." Beatrice stiffened. Julian muttered, "Well, that doesn't surprise me." Caroline continued, "I only wish I had insisted he rest instead of retreating to the study." Miss Marple patted her hand reassuringly. Miss Marple's observations. As the night progressed, Miss Marple pieced together tiny threads. She noticed. Beatrice's hands shook, but not from sorrow, from nervousness. Julian avoided meeting Inspector Briggs's eyes. Miss Crouch lingered near Caroline protectively, as though guarding her from an unseen threat. Caroline stared repeatedly toward the study door, whispering that James had been worried about some documents. Most peculiar. Late in the evening, after the interviews, Miss Marple slipped quietly to the study again. Snow fell outside in soft sheets. The inspector had allowed her a brief look at the desk, under his supervision. She examined the papers that had not been collected. A letter fragment caught her attention. It bore James Weatherby's handwriting. Cannot allow her to continue without confronting the truth. If the documents are discovered, the fragment ended abruptly torn. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. "Oh dear," she murmured. "I do believe this is rather more complicated than a simple holiday tragedy." As she left the study, she noticed another detail, wet footprints near the French doors leading to the terrace. But the doors were locked from the inside. "Curious," she whispered. Someone had been outside. Recently. And Miss Marple, with her keen blue eyes, felt more certain with each passing hour. This was no accident. It was murder. The next morning dawned pale and cold. Snow blanketed the grounds in a smooth white sheet, disturbed only by a few footprints, which the constables were now carefully examining. Inspector Briggs had spent much of the night questioning everyone again, and had requested that no one leave the estate. "It's a dreadful inconvenience," Julian grumbled over breakfast, stirring his porridge with unusual force. "Nonsense," Beatrice snapped. "A man is dead." Miss Marple observed how the two bristled at each other. She sensed an underlying tension, one that did not exist merely because of last night's tragedy. After breakfast, Miss Marple joined Inspector Briggs by the terrace doors. "These footprints," Briggs said, pointing, "lead from the garden to the terrace, then back again. Fresh snow fell after 10 o'clock, so they must have been from earlier." Miss Marple nodded. "And the French doors are locked from inside." "Meaning," Briggs said, "someone may have slipped out earlier, before James died. Or perhaps someone met him outside," Miss Marple added gently. "James did have melting snow on his boots." Briggs scribbled a note. "The suspicious documents." The constable returned with the results of the preliminary analysis of the stained documents. "Inspector, the papers show traces of a chemical agent, a common household poison in concentrated form." Beatrice gasped. Caroline pressed a hand to her chest. "Julian muttered poison. How ghastly!" Miss Marple nodded quietly, so her suspicions had been correct. "What exactly are these documents?" Briggs demanded. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "They relate to my late husband's estate." Julian's eyes widened. "Estate affairs. Why would James?" Caroline flushed. "There was no wrongdoing, I assure you." Miss Marple tilted her head. Caroline, she realized, was lying, though reluctantly. Miss Marple's quiet deductions. While others fretted, Miss Marple sat by the fire knitting, letting her mind sort through observations. She considered each suspect. Beatrice Weatherby had argued with James, perhaps over financial matters. Her reaction last night had been tinged with fear rather than shock. Julian Marsh had access to the study, had been overly familiar with Caroline. Possible motives: jealousy, money. Miss Eliza Cratch loyal to Caroline. But how far would that loyalty stretch? She had been in the kitchen preparing tea. Tea could hide many things. Mrs. Caroline Weatherby, harbouring secrets about the estate. Terrified by the documents James had been reviewing, but would she poison her own stepson? Miss Marple doubted it. She had seen enough human weakness to know that guilt did not always equate to malice. The broken pocket watch. A constable approached Briggs. "Sir, we found this near the edge of the yew wood." He held out a pocket watch, its glass cracked, chain broken. Miss Marple recognized it. She had seen it on James's waistcoat the previous evening. "But how did it end up outside?" Julian asked. No one answered. Miss Marple stepped closer, examining it. The time stopped at 8:47 p.m. She murmured, "That may have been when he dropped it, or when it was broken." Briggs frowned. What was he doing near the woods at that hour? Meeting someone. Miss Marple said quietly. A sudden turn. Around midday, a shriek echoed from the second floor. Beatrice had fainted in the corridor outside her room. Miss Marple and several others rushed to her aid. On the floor lay a small envelope, addressed to her. Inside was a single slip of paper. He knew the truth. "And so do I." Beatrice turned pale. Who would write this to me?" Miss Marple noted the handwriting. Bold, slanted, familiar. She tucked that detail away. Julian muttered, "Someone is playing games." Miss Crouch hissed, "This is monstrous." Caroline clung to Miss Marple's arm, trembling. "What is happening to us?" "My dear," said Miss Marple softly, "it seems someone is trying to frighten Mrs. Weatherby's household. And fear, often reveals more than truth alone." A red herring revealed. That afternoon, Miss Marple asked Mr. Hawtrey quietly, "Tell me, who has access to the estate's financial records?" The butler hesitated. "Mrs. Weatherby, Mr. James and Miss Crouch." Miss Marple nodded. "Not Julian. Not Beatrice. Interesting." Moments later, Miss Marple found Inspector Briggs beside the fire. "I believe our trouble lies not in James's marriage, nor in romantic entanglements," she said, "but in the estate itself." Briggs frowned. "Meaning?" "Someone feared exposure. James may have discovered something in those documents." Briggs exhaled sharply. "Embezzlement." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Inspector, I have learned never to guess beyond what facts suggest. But I do believe the poison was administered deliberately, perhaps through his drink, and the scene made to appear as if he collapsed while working." She glanced at the French doors. And someone went outside before or after? Briggs stared at her. Do you know who? Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. Not yet. But the clues are aligning, rather like stitches in my knitting. The day ended with no arrest, but tension hung in the manor like frost on window panes. Christmas Eve would bring answers. Miss Marple was certain of it. Miss Marple woke early on Christmas Eve to the sound of hushed voices drifting from the landing. She slipped on her shawl and stepped out to find Miss Crouch and Beatrice locked in a tense exchange. You have no proof, Beatrice hissed. I know guilt when I see it. Miss Crouch replied sharply. And you are hiding something. Beatrice's face flushed crimson. Stay out of my affairs. Miss Crouch's expression hardened. Ms. Weatherby deserves better than this chaos. Miss Marple intervened gently. Ladies, please. This is hardly the way to begin a morning. Both women fell silent. But Miss Marple had caught enough to add to her growing puzzle. After breakfast, Inspector Briggs requested the entire household gather in the drawing room for a final set of questions. Miss Marple sat quietly in an armchair, hands folded, eyes observant. Briggs began with the newest development, the broken pocket watch. It proves James went outside, Briggs said. Someone met him there. Julian shifted uneasily. Well, who? It certainly wasn't me. Miss Crouch sniffed. Nor I. I never left the house. Beatrice remained silent. Caroline whispered. James rarely ventured outside in the cold. Miss Marple nodded gently. Unless he expected something urgent. She turned to Beatrice. My dear, may I ask, did your husband confide in you about his work? His worries? Beatrice hesitated. He had been concerned about the estate accounts. That is all. Miss Marple tilted her head. Is that why you argued in London? Beatrice's eyes widened. How did? One learns a great deal by merely observing, Miss Marple said kindly. Your husband feared a discrepancy in the accounts. That much is clear. Julian leapt to his feet. Are you implying Caroline mismanaged the estate? That is outrageous! Caroline gasped. Julian, please. Miss Marple lifted a calm hand. No, Mr. Marsh. I do not believe Caroline is responsible. Julian deflated, then glanced apologetically at her. Miss Marple continued. But someone did mismanage something, and James was close to uncovering it. Briggs nodded. Which gives us a motive. Miss Crouch bristled. I have done nothing wrong. I handled the accounts only to relieve Mrs. Weatherby. She has been under tremendous strain. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Indeed, Miss Crouch, you are loyal. Too loyal, perhaps, to let Caroline suffer embarrassment. Miss Crouch's jaw tightened. I would protect her from anything. Miss Marple nodded slowly, even from the consequences of your own actions. A silence fell. Miss Crouch paled. You cannot be serious. Briggs stepped forward. Miss Crouch, you had access. You handled the books. Miss Crouch shook her head fervently. Yes, but I never. Miss Marple interrupted softly. And you were preparing tea in the kitchen with a cupboard containing household poisons. Another silence, but something wasn't right. Miss Marple felt it. She turned toward Beatrice. You fainted yesterday, Miss Marple said gently. And you received a threatening note. Why? Beatrice looked away. Because, Miss Marple continued, you recognized the handwriting. Julian froze. Caroline gasped. Beatrice trembled. Miss Marple produced the note. This was written by your husband. Briggs frowned. But James is dead. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. Which means he wrote it before his death. He meant to confront his wife. Beatrice, he believed you were hiding something from him. Beatrice's shoulders slumped. I owed money. A private matter I did not want him to know. Miss Marple nodded gently. And James discovered it. Yesterday, he planned to discuss it with you. That was the truth he mentioned. Julian exhaled sharply. So Beatrice had motive? No, Miss Marple said calmly. She had fear, not murder. She turned toward Julian, eyes narrowing. Mr. Marsh, you were overly anxious to steer suspicion away from Caroline, and you reacted strongly when estate finances were mentioned. Julian stiffened. You see, Miss Marple continued, James's broken pocket watch was found near the yew wood, and you, Mr. Marsh, often slip outside to smoke, despite claiming otherwise. Julian swallowed hard. And last night, Miss Marple added, you claimed to be playing billiards alone. Yet the chalk on the cue showed no recent use. Briggs's eyes widened. You lied about your alibi. Julian stumbled backward. I was only... Miss Marple approached him calmly. James discovered discrepancies in the estate accounts, she said softly. Discrepancies you created while assisting Caroline after her husband's death. Caroline gasped. Julian, Julian's eyes closed. Miss Marple continued. James confronted you on the terrace. You argued. The pocket watch broke. And later, you slipped poison into his drink when he retreated to the study. Briggs stepped forward. Is this true? Julian's voice cracked. I only borrowed the money. I meant to repay it. But James, he threatened to expose me. It would have ruined me. He sank into a chair, head in his hands. Caroline sobbed softly. Miss Marple rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. It is difficult, she said quietly, when the people we trust disappoint us. Inspector Briggs prepared to make the arrest. But Miss Marple stopped him. There is one more thing, she said. Something still unresolved. The drawing room fell into breathless silence. Inspector Briggs paused mid-step. Another thing, Miss Marple, she nodded. Yes, Inspector. Although Mr. Marsh poisoned James, the scene in the study was not entirely his doing. Julian looked up, horrified. What? I didn't. I know, Miss Marple said gently. You administered the poison, Mr. Marsh. But someone else altered the scene after James collapsed. All eyes turned to Miss Crouch. She stiffened. I only found... Miss Marple raised a hand. Let me explain. She stepped nearer to the fire, its glow reflecting in her eyes. When I examined the study, she said, I noticed something most peculiar. The papers on the desk were not in the order a solicitor would leave them in. They were arranged deliberately, as though someone had attempted to hide the most incriminating document. Caroline gasped. But who would? Someone who wished to protect you, Miss Marple said softly. Someone who would do anything to spare you distress. Miss Crouch trembled. Yes, I arrived moments after he collapsed. I panicked. I thought the papers might show something dreadful about you, Mrs. Weatherby. I tried to hide them, but when people began rushing in, I fled. Julian stared at her in shock. Miss Marple nodded kindly. You meddled, Miss Crouch, but not with malice. You acted out of misguided loyalty. Inspector Briggs cleared his throat. That interference, however, may still carry consequences. Miss Crouch lowered her head. I understand. Caroline reached out and touched her companion's hand. Eliza, thank you for trying to protect me, but please, never again. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The truth, however painful, is always kinder in the end. Briggs turned toward Julian. Mr. Marsh, I must ask, how did you administer the poison? Julian's voice was hollow. When James returned from outside, he poured himself a glass of brandy from the decanter. I distracted him, dropped a pen, pretended to look for it. He stepped out for a moment to fetch another document. I slipped a small amount into the glass. Beatrice flinched. And the footprints outside? Briggs asked. Julian shook his head. Those were his. He asked me to meet him near the yew wood. That's when we argued. He shoved me. I grabbed his coat. The watch broke. He called me a thief. I lost my temper. But I swear I didn't intend to kill him then. Miss Marple nodded. Anger, fear, desperation, they often push people toward terrible mistakes. Caroline whispered, tears trailing down her cheeks. He was like a brother to you, Julian. Julian bowed his head. I know. Briggs placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. You'll have to come with me. Miss Crouch led Caroline away gently, while Beatrice remained seated, pale but composed. When the room had quieted, Miss Marple approached Beatrice. My dear, she said, I am glad the truth did not involve you. I worried for a moment. Beatrice exhaled shakily. James and we had flaws, Miss Marple. But I would never harm him. I know, Miss Marple replied softly. A fear of judgment often makes us appear guilty when we are merely frightened. Beatrice gave a sad smile. Julian was escorted out through the snowy courtyard. The sight was a sorrowful one, yet necessary. Inspector Briggs offered Miss Marple a grateful nod. Thank you, Miss Marple. I'm not sure we would have solved this without you. Oh, I doubt that, Inspector, she said with a modest smile. I only follow the threads. The Manor at peace. By Christmas morning, Winterfold Manor had regained some semblance of calm. Snow glistened on the rooftops, and the scent of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. Caroline joined Miss Marple in the breakfast room. I cannot thank you enough. Caroline whispered. You have saved us from an unending cloud of suspicion. Miss Marple patted her friend's hand kindly. Nonsense, my dear. One does what one can, and you will stay for Christmas dinner. Please say yes. Miss Marple smiled warmly. I should be delighted. As they sat by the tree, Miss Marple thought quietly to herself. Human nature was a most fascinating puzzle. No matter the season, summer, spring, or the deepest days of winter, it remained the same curious mixture of weakness, courage, vanity, and kindness. And in that mixture, there was always the possibility of darkness, but also the chance for redemption. Winterfold's peace had been restored, and Miss Marple, serene and content, took a sip of her morning tea. Christmas, she decided, could now begin properly.